could have those conversations. You didn't have to have those conversations in some activist bubble.
Yeah.
Like, we could have them on working class areas all across Glasgow. And that felt much more transformational in some ways than a lot of my past experiences. So there's a question up here for a while.
Yeah, one example I was going to give of the fear of the establishment in hearing an alternative view is the pre-election debate, where they've only agreed to Tory, Liberal, Labour and UKIP,
Yes.
who have just recently got one MP through a defect from the Tory party. Yeah, they're allowed to go on. The Green Party and the other smaller left parties that would be putting forward an alternative programme, they've got to be excluded. You know, I mean, that would be a marvellous opportunity to get an alternative policy put before a mass audience, and it shows you the fear of the establishment that actually happening. In fact, I think the Greens are organising a petition against it, aren't they? The Young Greens, as a website petition. But as the Morning Star made the point very well in their editorial the other day, when they said if they'd allowed Caroline Lucas to go on, that would have thrown the cat among the pigeons. And likewise George Galloway, the Respect Party, you know, anyone that's going to put forward an alternative programme. Now, I've mentioned the Morning Star. Another example is the BBC's refusal to include that in the What the Papers Say. You know, on Radio 4 you've got several press reviews, likewise on television, but a paper that continually, day after day, puts out an alternative vision are totally excluded. So that's an example, you know, of the way they work and why they don't want movements like this to gain publicity and ground. Yeah.
But that's what, like, in Scotland actually, because the Greens in Scotland did manage to participate in quite a few of the online debates, and I mean, that's not the reason it moved to the left, of course not, because it was the grassroots, but that helped. Like, that did. Like, having Patrick Harvey, who was one of the co-speakers of the Greens, Patrick Harvey, who's one of the co-speakers of the Greens in Scotland, he was on TV quite a lot before the referendum in Scotland, and that was extremely helpful in opening up the debate and making it much more genuine than it would have been otherwise, because they managed to get in there, and that's why they don't want it. Right, precisely.
And it's interesting because while the electoral turnout has declined to an enormous extent in the Scottish referendum, where people knew they'd got something to actually vote for, there was this massive turnout, particularly among young people. And the parties such as the Greens and the SNP that were campaigning for the yes vote have actually increased the membership to an enormous degree. I think I read the other day, Derek Wall wrote a piece. He said, I think it was about 6,000 people have joined the Green Party in Scotland, you know, during and since the referendum. So it shows you a campaign on a real issue will generate some interest. But people are absolutely conned into this idea, you know, that we've got to accept things as they are. It's an act of God. It's, you know, like something we can't actually do anything about. And this is the big obstacle we've got, is to get to tell people this is one big lie. Yeah.
Just one question about, you talked about the transition from Mubarak to democracy back to military rule. You didn't say much about Morsi and how the people felt about him, and you talked about the disconnect between Tahrir Square and the rest of the country. Can you just say a bit about what was the dynamic that got rid of Morsi? Was it people-led or was it purely military?
It wasn't purely military, definitely not. Like, my take from my time there was a lot of people really hated the Brotherhood. The Brotherhood now it's different, was an extremely strong organisation with a lot of roots in the community and had put in a lot of work over many decades in building that up, both in quite middle class communities and also providing charity and aid in poorer communities that people relied on. So that gave it deep roots. It was also extremely neoliberal, wanted to privatise everything. Like, in the first presidential elections that Morsi and the Brotherhood won, when Khaled Shatta, who was actually Morsi's superior, spoke to the corporations, then afterwards their response was, my God, we wouldn't dare ask for that much. He's offering much more in terms of corporate profits. And And people were pissed off with that. Like, there were massive union mobilizations against them from the left. Also, the Brotherhood was very hierarchical, very stubborn, and not open to discussion. So they wanted to impose their will. And that alienated masses of people. So there was a grassroots movement, including from the revolutionaries and left, to get rid of Morsi. But the military, which had an alliance with Morsi, I mean, there's no doubt, and that was partly why the revolutionary left mobilized against Morsi, was because the military was working with Morsi, so it seemed to make sense to go for Morsi because he was with the military. What we didn't realize at the time was that the military was also plotting to bring down Morsi, and was initially slowly, like the first big protests against Morsi, I would say were grassroots and not that influenced by the military, but we had some problems because some right-wing people would come along, and there ended up being fistfights between revolutionaries and individual supporters of the old regime. But then over the last 6 months of Morsi, increasingly the intelligence services started pumping in money and pumping in resources, and the media was spinning stories, and so by the time Morsi fell, there was popular support for Morsi to fall, but there was definitely a lot of military involvement in making that happen. Would be my take. I would say Morsi did win an election, but I don't call him democratically elected because there was also mass opposition to him.
Can I just make
and then we should
gotta
wrap up. So
yeah,
that's
because it is an interesting thing, and I don't want to get into the detail of it. I mean, I've got a slightly different take on it, because you see, I think there is a general lesson there. For me, I mean, I would have been against Morsi in terms of his economic policy, but when it comes to the point where even the limited democracy that existed in Egypt was under threat from the military, who were saying, who were kind of pretending to be against Morsi because the people were against Morsi, but actually were trying to divide and rule the whole movement, then I think the movement should, and I wasn't there and I'm not criticising it, it's easy to criticise from here. There should have been a time when the movement said, hang on a minute, we will defend democracy against the state, even if the people in government are not people we like. And I think there's an important lesson there, because, and you can bring a kind of, there's a sort of very clunky analogy to the current situation. I mean, there's a debate in the movement about whether or not we should have, for example, Labour MPs on platforms against the cuts, when their sort of record is reasonably good, but because they're in the Labour Party, maybe we shouldn't have them. Or trade union leaders who haven't been as good as they should have been, but nevertheless are prepared to speak on our side. And in my view, it's very, very important that we take the view, the radicals take the view that we're not going to give up all our differences, but we are going to work with anyone else who's against the war or against austerity. It doesn't matter if they're in the Labour Party. Lots of people, good people, are still in the Labour Party. I don't agree with them, but they're still there because they're hanging on to those illusions. And I think in those circumstances, we have to say, obviously I'm not talking about total privatisers or pro-cuts people in the Labour Party, but we need to make the broadest possible alliances in action. Because if we do that, we'll pull them a bit towards us, and also in a certain sense, you put them on the spot. It's very important to do that. And so I think, I think it's great, for example, that last night you had various different people down. You had Vivienne Westwood and Ken Loach, but I'd get anyone you can. I'd get MPs to come down and support you. I know Corbyn and McDonnell have been down here, but let's build the widest possible, the broadest possible movement. And if people say they're against the cuts, then say, come on then, if you're against the cuts, join us.
Exactly.
Rather than taking the sort of purist line that some people do, which is that, oh no, back in 2001 you voted the wrong way on this bill. If someone's prepared to step up, let them step up, and they'll bring other people with them. People slag off Owen Jones, for example, and say, oh, whatever, I don't know what people say about him, but to be honest with you, he represents a big body of opinion in British society. If we can get Owen Jones into a particular campaign, that brings a lot of people with him, and that's a good thing. And I think the same applies to this situation, really. I would have been for saying, I would have defended the Muslim Brotherhood. I hope that I would have had the courage to march with the Muslim Brotherhood against the state, even though I totally disagree with most of their policies. They were democratically elected, and that would have been the way to take the movement forward, in my opinion.
I think lots of people in Egypt, in retrospect, agree with that.
Yeah, I know.
But,
It's easy to
but
say.
at the time when
No.
they were in government, it was hard. But now that is one of the reflections people have had, that there was a strategic mistake, which is a useful thing for us to learn from.
Yeah. No, as I say, it's easy.
Yeah. I think we should end because they want to start another one. Yeah. Thanks for being here. Yeah. It's called Platform.